The first one banning chokeholds and strangleholds is the way they put it in the 8 Can't Wait website. We haven't approved or trained any of those types of holds in over 2 decades. Like a number of these things, we have tried to stay ahead of the curve through time and, frankly, legislation and court cases, and what's best for our constituents. And so like I said, we haven't done that in an awful long time. And so I think some people are surprised that police in Central Texas, law enforcement in Central Texas, really hasn't done a lot of these things in a long time. They haven't been approved. Now, in a deadly force situation, that's kind of all bets are off. But it just goes to show that policing is done differently across the country. And so lumping all the police into one pot can be difficult. So it's attempting to lay all of societal's ills at the feet of police. And the truth is, there are some deep systemic issues about race and the mistreatment of communities of color that reach far beyond policing. And so it's got to be a robust conversation about all of those things that pervade systems in the United States that lean towards affecting communities of color. Sure, I think what I ask all of our officers to do, regardless of the community they're serving at the time, is that they treat everybody with respect. They treat them as if it was their mother, brother, sister, father, uncle, as if they would want to be treated. And that sounds cliche, but if you treat everybody with respect, the same respect you would want to be treated with, then typically those things work out. Now, some of the actions of police are dictated by the people they're dealing with. And so, for us, it's about treating all of our communities with respect. You may have heard me say, and I've said it in some open forums, we have to serve several different communities that all happen to live here in Waco together. And each community has its own concerns and its own viewpoints of police. The badge and the uniform mean something different to every community. And so we expect our officers to be responsive to all those communities. From just a socioeconomic standpoint, we have to be responsive to the communities that pay all the taxes. And some folks will remind us of that. Then you have to be responsive to communities of folks that work paycheck to paycheck. They work 50, 60, 70 hours a week to support their families. They barely get by. But then we also have to serve equally, and some would say more so, the communities who have no check to no check, who don't have their own resources, who can't protect themselves. The police, we have almost a larger obligation to people who can't protect themselves than we do to people who have resources. And we try to do that evenly. My expectations are, I just said this at the graduation this morning of the new 12 officers. I've said it in roll calls. I'm sure my officers can say it word by word from hearing me say it so much, and the assistant chiefs and commanders and everybody else. We expect people to treat our citizens with respect. Sometimes that's dictated by what you're getting back from people in different situations. But that's the expectation. And I think we've shown a pretty good record of holding people accountable if for some reason that didn't happen. Sure, I think as you go through the ranks and higher up in the ranks, and frankly as a police officer or a sergeant, holding other people accountable is one of the things you have to do when you take the oath of office. That comes with it. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are times when you have to hold, if you're going to hold citizens accountable, you certainly have to hold police officers accountable. And frankly, we try to hold our officers to a higher level of accountability. And one of the sayings I've adopted, I believe it can be attributed to Sam Houston, was, "I'm going to do the right thing and suffer the consequences." And the longer I was in management, the more I find that to be true every day. And particularly now in a country that is divided, and not just slightly divided. It's not just 49 to 51%. It is polar opposites, where people can't even come together and have respectful conversations about things they disagree on. So now you take that and you work it into human emotion about an adult being told they did something wrong. I tell people, when an adult receives discipline, they go through the same stages of grief as if they've lost a loved one, because that's your integrity somebody is calling out. And the fact of the matter is, in police work, we hire a bunch of type A personalities, and we say, go play well with others, because we want that officer who will walk into gunfire and, oh yeah, by the way, go tell a parent that their baby was killed in a car wreck. We want that officer who can make the split-second decision on the scene. Even when a psychologist can't diagnose somebody, we want the officer to be able to diagnose all of their mental health issues and get them proper treatment. And so you ask so much of officers, and we have over 100,000 police citizen contacts in this city alone a year. So when you do have to give discipline, it's a big deal, because people feel like, well, I let the department down. As the chief, you feel, you're having to tell another human being that they did wrong. But when I took the oath of office, you know what you're getting yourself into, and that's part of the gig. And so you have to do the right thing regardless of the thing. That's why chiefs have shelf lives. Chiefs in medium to large departments around the country, they don't last forever. And it's because even if you're doing everything right, there just comes a time when you're stale, because either you've taken too much discipline, you've held too many people accountable, or while at the same time the other side will be saying you're not holding enough people accountable. That's the reality. That's just life. So each person in that position has to do the best they can do, make the best decisions with the information they have at hand, and live with those decisions, move down the road. When you talk about arresting a police officer, that's pretty significant, but we've done that. Yes, I've been screaming from the mountaintops for a while now about mental health. Why is it that you would want police to be your entry into mental health services as a community? But as I said on a radio show the other night, when nobody else is willing to do the work, who do you call? The community calls the police and expects the police to solve the problem, whether it's mental health, homelessness, which goes to financial insecurity and education issues and a lot of other things. But there are plenty of people who want the police to solve these issues and demand it. I've heard this conversation. I think it's interesting that a lot of police chiefs, certainly as the legislative liaison for the Texas Police Chiefs Association, last legislative session, we lobbied for more mental health services, and we were told, the money's not there. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, the major cities chiefs, Art Acevedo has talked about this. There are a lot of things that why do you want police doing those things? Particularly things that require finesse and other things in the community to come help support that. We really have moved beyond, the police enforcing criminal laws. People, you take custody battles. That's a civil situation that a judge has weighed into. But every day in this city and in this country, police are required to intervene in custody battles. Well, there happen to be some criminal laws attached to it, but you got to be pretty significant, pretty severe before we have any jurisdiction in it. Mental health is a civil jurisdiction given to police. Not only do we not have the resources to do it, you could never get enough training. People get PhDs. Even an LPC has to be a master's level person. Not all of my officers are we have a lot of master's degrees, but why do you want police doing that? I think there are some really good programs around the country. Dallas involved the Meadows Institute. There's a thing called the Colorado Springs model, which is one member of law enforcement going with social workers, medical personnel, people that can provide immediate medical attention, for high blood pressure, all those sort of things that affect people. And they go out as a group, and some mental health professionals, and they go out and try to keep crises from happening. Because when crises happen, when the family calls the police because their loved one, because of a mental health issue, not because of any criminal intent, either has a gun or a knife or is destroying the house or assaulting their family member, and then the police go out, and when you go out and a person has a gun or a knife, your options suddenly get very narrow. And so, we used to say family violence was the most dangerous thing police officers go on. Those are still very dangerous things, but we've done a lot of things in police work, particularly in Waco. We have an entire unit that all they do is work family violence calls, and we have counselors as part of that. And so that what you try to do is to keep the offenders from recidivating, back in and teach the victims how to not be codependent and all those things. There's a lot of effort behind that. But we've got to do the same thing in mental health. The behavioral health leadership team, I sit on the behavioral health leadership team with people from government, people from medicine, all the major philanthropic organizations in town are part of that. They're doing some great work. It's just somebody's got to pay for it, But I've heard these discussions, and I'm like, yes, please, let's try to narrow those things. Investigation of wrecks. The reality is nowadays we do those for insurance companies. So and there are conflicts that occur at those, and there are all kinds of these things. And I forget the exact number, but the vast majority of our calls are not criminal justice related; they're service related. And as populations grow and as they grow fast, then police are called on to do more of these service related things, like solve disagreements among neighbors about property lines. Property lines in Texas is a huge thing. It's all civil, but as police officers, they're called out all the time because two neighbors can't agree where a property line is. Somebody wants to cut the branches of the tree that's on their property, but the branches overhang their neighbor's property. So, and regardless of what you do in those situations, you're wrong. But police are being asked to solve those problems, and you're always half wrong. If you're trying to solve a problem between two people, you're always half wrong.
Right.
Well, and I will say, when people recount particular instances, there are always, even in a two-person conversation, there's three things. There's your story, my story, and what was really going on. And so people will remember situations how they're going to remember them. That was their perception, so that's their reality. For police officers, when you get the 911 call, when the dispatcher notifies you on the radio, and you can even see the information that the caller gave to the officer on the mobile data computers that we have in our cars. But as you're driving to that call, that's all you know. And I've often said that if everybody knew everybody, we wouldn't have a lot of the conflict, because if I know that you're normally very calm and this is an anomaly what you're doing here, then and I know you personally, then we can work through things a little longer. But if a police officer gets to a scene, particularly after the family are the ones that have called 911 and said, please come, this person's, they say things like they're out of control, they've hurt somebody, they've got a knife or a gun, or all those things. So officers process those things as they're arriving at the scene. And then as they get out of their vehicles, they're supposed to know what's going on. And unfortunately, in mental health situations, you can't always communicate with the person. Either maybe they're nonverbal, or they have a DSM-5 diagnosis that makes them hear voices. Those are very real things, and to them, that is that's a very real thing. And so they're trying to decide whether to listen to you or to the voices. The family members are often very upset for good reason. When police get on scene, for some people, for some of our communities, that raises tensions. And so, regardless sometimes of what you do about trying to slow things down, reduce tensions, frankly, if somebody pulls a gun or a knife, then again, your options get real narrow, minus some de-escalation techniques that we talk about of time and distance. If we can get hard cover, if we can get good distance, if there's nobody else that's placed in danger, because we're not only responsible when we arrive at the scene, we're not only responsible for the officers there, but now we're responsible for every being that's standing there, whether they're involved in this situation or not, innocent bystander or not. And those officers are responsible for everybody at the scene. And so, sometimes making decisions in that kind of environment. I mean, I've seen I've seen an MD and a PhD in an emergency room arguing about a diagnosis for a mental health consumer. But you want a police officer who has, yes, we do mental health training. It's ongoing training. We do crisis intervention training. We do de-escalation. But a police officer, and I've had them ask me, "What do I do, Chief?" I was like, "Well, don't get between an MD and a PhD. That's their thing." And so, can we always do better? Yes, we can always do better, and we should. And we're having conversations about what that looks like, with our council, with our management. Things cost money, and so if we're really serious about these things, then rather than defunding some things, we need to be funding some things, and then hold people accountable for that. That's part of government. But you can't say, well, we can't deal with it any other way, so let's let police deal with it. It's about maybe we look at are we requiring police to do too many things, and maybe we should properly fund some of these other things. Now in Waco, like I said, we answer 100,000 calls for service a year. Unfortunately, 911 is a gift and a burden. It's a gift in that if you need a police officer or an ambulance or a fire truck, you call 911. Now, in the old days, when 911 came in the late 80s, everybody had to go somewhere to call. They had to go to a payphone or go to work or go to home before they could call. Now, every call is an in-progress call. And you get multiple calls about it, and with very often conflicting information about what's going on and what the expectations are. And so the officer has to take all of that, because if the three of us all grow up in different ways, we may see something going on and we may articulate that to the dispatcher in different ways. And the dispatcher puts all that information in and sends it all to the officer. So now the officer's got conflicting information. I've seen at the scene where people will everybody's describing one person, but they describe them vastly different. And so an officer has to wade through all that information and make some sense of it. And by the way, make life and death decisions in a split second. Yeah, so I think the fact that I could call leaders in the community when we were going to have our first protest, that I could call those leaders and get the information about the organizers, call them on the phone, and talk through what their expectations were, what their goals and objectives were, that we could relay what our expectations were about the safety of everybody involved, the safety of property even, and then talk about how we could help them achieve their goals. You can't do that unless there's at least some level of trust that what you're saying, that you're going to back it up. And so when I became chief, and frankly as an assistant chief under Brent Stroman, when we went out of the community, I always told people, look, I get that my words have to match my actions, okay? And I'm never going to lie to you. And I had more than one of them say, I appreciate that, but if you only get one chance. Well, I take that to heart because I know what the playing field is. I get one chance, and if I ever, lie to a person or mislead them, then I know I'm effectively incapable of dealing with that person in the future. And that's the job of a chief, one of many jobs of the chief and assistant chiefs, is to work on those relationships every day. I just told these graduating officers, and I've said it to every graduating class for at least the last, I've been in management now 15 years. So for the last 15 years, I've been able to get in front of graduating classes. And I've told them, look, when you deal with a citizen, you have to think of it as you're either putting money in the bank of trust or you're taking it out. And for that citizen, that may be the only time they deal with a police officer in a year. And they're going to go tell at least five people about that, that interaction with a police officer. And it's either positive or negative. Very, very seldom do people go, yeah, I got pulled over they gave me a ticket. No, it's, I got pulled over and either, they wrote me a ticket, but you know what? That officer was very respectful and they were doing their job. And you know what? I was speeding. I get that a lot. People will call or write and say, hey, I deserved the ticket, but I got to tell you, your officer was very respectful and was pleasant during the encounter. Or is it going to be, matter of fact, there was a guy at the rally who said, I was harassed, I was pulled over, I was given a warning, but I was harassed. So it's about procedural justice, right? Many studies show that it doesn't really matter to people the outcome of unless it's very severe. I mean, there's anomalies there, but the outcome usually doesn't matter so much as how the person feels they were treated during the interaction. Were their concerns taken into account? And there are times when officers can extend discretion, but there are times when they cannot. I think there's a misunderstanding too that any interaction with police is harassment. The reality is police have to go. When people call 911, the police have to get there and then they have to figure out what's going on. If there's nothing going on, then typically they want to go on to the next call. They want to let you go to your, on about your business. The Sandra Bland Act took away the authority of police officers to give verbal warnings on traffic stops now. So now, if I stop a car for anything, I either have to give a written warning or a ticket. Well, just the nature of me continuing that detention long enough to give the written warning, and then I got to ask for your ID because in order to write a written warning, I got to positively identify you. I can't just say, "Hey, could you slow down?" or "Can you get that light fixed?" or whatever. Statutorily, that discretion has been taken away from police officers. So the legislature has created an additional tension for police officers that they have to work through. So now, that's been a big thing for our officers because they, that was a useful tool to be able to say, hey, slow down or fix the light or could you come to a complete stop next time? And then just send people on their way. So, and if you tell police officers you always have to do this and there's no discretion, is that good or bad? Well, then everybody gets treated the same. But if everybody's being treated poorly the same, it's still a bad thing, So anyway. I think we're 10% African American, which is below what our community is, but we're making progress. It's higher than it was when I got here, but we are above the national average for women, so I have to explain a lot of times in community meetings that we're a civil service agency. I can only hire people that apply, and then I have to hire them in the order they score on the civil service test. And so we say, okay, well, that's a systemic issue. What can we do about that? So as a department, we give help on how to take the written test. We give help on how to take the physical agility test, actually give people the opportunity to go practice it. We put out a YouTube video. We hired a consultant to ensure that our physical agility test didn't affect minorities or women deferentially. The Department of Justice was suing the Corpus Christi Police Department for a very similar, the way our physical agility used to be. So we hired a consultant, came in and verified the way. We made some changes to ensure, and so we don't lose near the number of women, particularly as we used to on the old, push-ups and that sort of thing. So it's about looking at every system. It's about looking at every process and trying to help identify what is it that we can do in those systems. The next chief is, what I want, because I feel like I have some ownership. And so what I think all of us want as the next chief is somebody who insists that, of the same things we've been doing, that everybody's treated respectfully and everybody is, has the same rights in our interactions. There have been some people who have been very vocal about what they, some of the more overt things they want from a chief. But I think it should go to the person's heart, and their actions. Do they have a track record of engaging the community through a lens of equity? That was in our posting. That whoever the next chief is has to have a demonstrated role in their previous agencies of community engagement through a lens of equity. Obviously there's a lot of personality traits you want. You want somebody who's thoughtful and methodical and honest and all those things that we can all list. But by the way, they're human. We're just trying. We want the best person to fit Waco, and there are some very interesting opinions about that. COVID really pushed us back, I know some cities where they just have called off their processes. Yeah. There are a lot of chiefs processes going on in the country right now, and there are a lot of places that either called it off completely or just named a semi-permanent interim. I think we need a new permanent person to do that. It's only fair for them to be able to get here and get their feet on the ground and engage the community. So we're going to move forward. Maybe by August, we could have somebody named and somebody get here. We sent out a survey to a number of community leaders to ask them what they wanted in their next chief. Yeah. And it was community leaders of all the different communities we serve. It was people in government. It was the chiefs of all the surrounding agencies. Sort of what I did was I made a list of everybody that I would deal with day to day that I felt some accountability to. Mm-hmm. And it's a very diverse group, and ask them what it is they want, what were the major issues they see for police, what do they want from a personality standpoint, those kinds of things. Number 2 is required de-escalation. So what does that mean exactly when you talk about de-escalation? And it's only been in the very recent years that even International Association of Chiefs of Police has articulated what is de-escalation. What does that mean? But our officers, I remember when I got here 24 plus years ago, and the senior patrol officers would be, hey, slow down, let's not rush in there. Let's solve these problems. I saw old-time patrol officers give people divorces on the street, and just very, very engaged. But that was, and even beyond that, before 911, now everything's call driven. Hey, by the way, Sergeant, you've got 5 calls holding. One of them's a stabbing, and so it's call driven. So de-escalation. What we train specifically is in very dangerous situations, give time and distance. If you can get hard cover and create distance so that you don't have to always be upping the tension, or if you go into a domestic disturbance. In the old days, you'd go in and you'd roll in, and it was about command presence. You're taking control. Well, you still have to do that, but it's about trying to get people calmer. Rather than demanding them submit to your authority, it's about, hey, can we talk? Can we talk this through? Can you guys separate for just a second, and let's, going into situations with enough officers. So one officer doesn't go in and try to get between a husband and a wife and a brother and others. You get enough officers there to be able to separate people and have rational conversations. So you try to lower the tensions, and so we've been doing that. I mean, that's just been part of the thing. People want to say, well, you need to be doing community policing. Well, but if we're doing all of the things in patrol now, yeah, we got to give them more time. But that's a measure of how many officers you have. That's what that boils down to. Either you have enough officers to have time to get out and meet people, and they're not devoted to just answering calls, or you don't. In the 90s, we had narcotics officers on bicycles in teams. We had 2 teams of 5 and a sergeant on each. Yeah. And they would answer calls, and we assigned them to particular neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Then in each of the neighborhoods, we had a neighborhood police officer who was a liaison to essentially other city services. So they would go to community meetings, and people would say, well, our street light is out in our alley. Mm-hmm. And rather than contacting utilities or whoever on that street light, they would go through the police officer. And so the police officer was never about, they didn't do any police work. It was about engaging the community, which is also police work. But it wasn't criminal work. They were a liaison to all the other city, services. And so to a lot of people, that is community policing, of having the officers get out of their cars and shake and howdy and know all their people, and they know somebody in a uniform that they can come to for all of their problems. Or Joe will call about 2 neighbors down the street. They would go to their neighborhood officer and say, hey, there's a problem down the street that we need to get ahead of. Go down there and reduce conflict over a boundary line, or somebody's garden is over into somebody else's yard or whatever. And so to a lot of people, that is community policing. Right. It is very expensive, but it gives each neighborhood somebody they know who to call. Mm-hmm. Well, could you accomplish that same thing and it not have to be a uniformed officer? Maybe. But again, everybody, the theory is people want to talk to a police officer. And so you've got these diverging sort of stories about nobody trusts the police, but we want more of them in our neighborhood. And I would really love us to be able to have a conversation about narrowing that down. So one of the things I'm going to do on Tuesday is I've gone back to the presidential commission that President Obama put together on the 21st century policing. And in that 117 or 118 page document, I forget which, there are dozens and dozens of recommendations and action items. Now, what I've done is I've created a matrix, and I'm going through and saying, okay, that's a federal action item, that's a state action item, okay, here's a law enforcement action item. And I'm taking an inventory of those and identifying which ones we've already done. If a lot of people agree that they think those are good things for policing, then I have to go in and say, okay, is this a law enforcement issue? If it is, then are we doing this? De-escalation, training on de-escalation is one. Banning chokeholds is another. Some of these, a duty to intervene is another. And so we've done those things. So good for us, check mark. But there are a number of things in their recommendations that we should at least look at and consider for ways to move forward, because this commission spent a lot of time identifying things that create trust between law enforcement and the community. And so maybe use that as a starting point, and maybe hold some community discussions about, what is, because again, remember, we serve all these communities. And so you have to figure out what each community wants, because there are very differing opinions about what each community wants. And so we've got to sort through those, find out where we have room, what can we do within our current resources. Do I need to go ask for additional resources? Maybe we need less resources in some area. Maybe we can divert some to something else. Mm-hmm. So it's doing that evaluation from the lens of those recommendations from the 21st Century Policing Committee. And some of them are very vague, like the police department should work with schools to provide alternative disciplinary measures.
What does that mean?
For youth.
What does that mean?
Well, really that's a school function. And in Texas, you've seen police really be brought out of schools. There for a while, everything became a ticket. And you've seen laws change in Texas that really, thank goodness, required schools to handle things again as discipline that should have always been handled as discipline, but over time schools just turned to police officers to handle. And the legislature, the actual laws in Texas changed about 2 legislative sessions ago. But then, we get into this whole active shooter thing. And why aren't you in schools? Well, you didn't want us in schools. Well, it turns out we want you in schools. So now we've got to get police officers back in schools. So now you see districts with their own police departments, Hewitt and Woodware and Midway, school district doing a great job of it. So there's competing interests there, competing demands of police, just like schools. Yeah. Do you want them in or out? And if they're in, what do you want them doing? So there is that. So a lot of things. I'm trying to do an inventory. I want to be able to provide that to the council so we can say, we've done these things, we were leading in these things. Here's some additional recommendations that maybe we don't do. But as the people who set policy, do you want to consider these things? Because we work for the council. And they are beholden to the community. What I'm seeing and there's a lot of these sorts of campaigns going around, and there are some, some things where groups want to adopt this as their statement. And what I'm seeing a lot of is that they want to solve very complicated problems with very simple rhetoric. Right. And that's not going to be a good solution. If we don't get serious about getting into the layers of these problems and solving them from the root level, then we're going to be back here again. Right. I am very sensitive to some of our local leaders who say, I'm tired of talking about stuff. I want to see things solved. Okay. Well, then let's get down to what is the root cause. Where does if you're going to lay fault, where does the fault lie? I would rather than saying where does the fault lie, I would say how do we fix this? But you're talking about very systemic community issues that are going to have to be solved. Some of them within the police department. Yeah, I think both is true. Yeah. I think in the current environment, it is very difficult to be a police officer because what some people think is any use of force by police is bad. Well, certainly any use of force by police looks bad on camera, but if police have an obligation to take a felon into custody or a misdemeanor into custody, if they have an obligation and the person is fighting or assaulting the police officer, then you have to use the amount of force necessary to take the person into custody. That's the obligation of the police. And so, but I'm getting some contact by some people in the community who feel any contact with a police officer is harassment and or is not. Why are they here? Well, they were called here. 911, somebody called and said, could you come look at this? Why does it matter? Why are they here? So that's the difficulty, is perceptions of some people think, you know, that we, you know, nobody should be held accountable for anything. Regardless of the law you break, you just need a hug. But at the same time, we in the profession feel like we have to solve these issues. We recognize that police work is a noble profession, protecting people who can't always protect themselves, and sometimes even when they don't want protection. You know, you're still going to do the right thing. Or what I said earlier, do the right thing, suffer the consequences. That's where police work is at right now. But we also hear from so much of our community of how much they appreciate the way we do our business. We just need to honor that appreciation by continuing to do it in respectful ways, have these difficult conversations, hope that we can find people that can find common ground and can be rational about, you know, why some things have to be done. Some things, maybe we change, like we talked about earlier, maybe we change about what the police do. But there's got to be at least a conversation about it, and go from there. So both things are true. It's in every profession. I had a nurse call in at one of the radio show I did on a Saturday morning before one of the protests. A nurse called in and she asked me about that. She said, well, you can have all the policies in the world, but what if they don't do it? I said, then we hold them accountable. If we find out they didn't do it, then we hold them accountable. And she says, well, you know, there's even been times where in my profession, I wish I did such and such. And I said, yeah, that's the example. It turns out we are human beings. And so it's about setting expectations, having the right policies, and then holding people accountable for it. Now, holding people accountable and getting justice does not always mean retribution. And so you have to be methodical about that, because sometimes holding people accountable and seeing justice done doesn't get you retribution. And so that has to be a conversation too about what is it we expect from people. You know, if somebody is rude to you, do they deserve to lose their career? You know, if they use profanity with somebody, do they deserve to lose their career? You know, say they're a 30-year officer and they use profanity with you, provoked or unprovoked. Does that person deserve to lose their career? You know, or is a day off or you know, a written reprimand or, you know, the embarrassment of being called down by the chief, is that enough? It's not retribution. That's discipline. But for some people, nothing short of them losing their job. I've had people tell me that on the phone. You know, he was rude to me. He doesn't need to be wearing the badge. Well, let's put things in context. You know, of 30-year careers, and you know, now if that's the last straw of a number of things, then maybe right. Maybe it's not. They don't need to be the police anymore. But maybe it was a bad day. So it's about context and evaluating people. I've asked in a number of investigations. I've asked the investigators, is this officer salvageable? Even for very serious things, is that person salvageable? Because if we're going to talk about procedural justice, it can't just be for the public. It needs to be for the police officers too, and they have rights, and we have to. And in our department, we have to balance that through civil service, where a civilian arbitrator can come in and overturn the chief's decision about discipline, and all of those things are laid out in state law, by the way. You know, very very narrow actions by the chief, and by the way, internal affairs is the only disciplinary system we have. So if you say, well, how many IA investigations do you have, Chief? If I were to say, and I don't know what the number is, they're supposed to be getting it together for me. If I say 72, you're like, oh my goodness, your department is corrupt. Well, if 70 of those were backing into a pole with a car, it's not quite as bad then.
Yeah.
So it's about context. Yeah. Now, if we had that many investigations about uses of force, and they were brought by the public, the reality is most of our investigations start inside the department. Police officers holding other police officers accountable for their actions. The vast majority, and I'm gonna give those stats on Tuesday to the council. And some of those, you know, if we use deadly force, we're required to be on our website and report to the state, and Texas is ahead in a lot of these mandatory reporting things. We give racial profiling reports to the council every year. We have to report that to the state. So Texas is leading some of these things too. There were some very good things that came out of the Sanders-Bland Act. Yeah. I think that hold people accountable and trying to get people mental health services rather than putting them in jail. We've been doing that for years here. Sequential lineups. We've been doing blind lineups to protect against false eyewitness identification for at least a decade. I mean, we were so far ahead of there's still departments out there doing 6-up deals or live lineups or whatever else. We have a racial profiling policy that we put into effect. We have a policy just about, what was it, Senate Bill 4? Because our Hispanic community, they have a whole different set of expectations, and immigration is one of those. Yeah. So, any racial profiling is prohibited at our department by policy. When I became chief, that duty to intervene, we felt like our what we call General Order 1001, which sort of talks about just general code of conduct, which is always be honest, don't use profanity, all those kinds of things. We felt like that covered it. Well, we found out through an arbitrator's ruling that it didn't. So then I put a policy in that says, oh, by the way, you must intervene if you see anybody being mistreated. You must repeat it or tell the department immediately. Well, I think first of all, it's got to begin in recruiting. You want to, as everybody says, you want your department to reflect your community. Now, that's a good and noble goal, but it won't solve your issues. There's too many studies across departments that do reflect their communities, and it makes it a little easier, but it doesn't necessarily solve all your problems. So then during the hiring process, you make sure through psychological evaluations. I believe we ought to use emotional intelligence testing. Now, civil service doesn't allow for that, but I've been working on how do we do emotional intelligence testing and put that in there. I had talked to Tarleton State University's School of Sociology about doing some studies and trying to validate that as a way to show over a period of 5 years or 10 years that people with a high emotional quotient tend to have fewer complaints. I believe that's true, but I'm a data nerd. I want to see if it's true. Because you can have a very empathetic person who has led a very sheltered life, regardless of what race they come from. Right. Because we serve all communities. So then, once you get them in, then it's also about training. I went to San Jose, California, and frankly, and their chief said I could do it. I'm taking one of their training programs where they bring new officers in and they show them all the reasons why different communities see what the badge and the uniform means differently. And so, because and this is a poor example, but if you go into a party and you've got spinach in your teeth, you want to know you've got spinach in your teeth. Well, when you put that uniform on, you take on all the sins of all the fathers and mothers before you. Sure. And so we owe it to our young officers. We hired 2 this time that turned 21 in the academy. That's pretty unusual. Usually we hire, we've got one guy that is retiring from the military from flying helicopters for 20 years. That's more typical of the people we hire, that they've got life experience, they've got wisdom. They don't only have the wisdom, but they've got discernment on when to use that wisdom. Right. And so we've got to give diversity training. We've got to give implicit bias training. We've got to give the history of policing in this country. Why do some cultures, and not just race, but what about a religious affiliation? Because we have populations of Muslim communities in our communities. Sure. Yeah. And so we need to know about that and their perception of law enforcement.
So you're doing this training now, or you're
yeah. So we've done a little bit of it. We've done inherent bias training. A number of times we've done multiculturalism training. I mean, there are different facets of this interaction with different communities. But the one that that I'm really pushing to get here, and Mr. Ford is talking about maybe rolling it out to the entire city group, is to talk about the things that have happened in Waco and Texas that form people's viewpoints of not only police, but cause racial tension.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of things specific to Texas, and there are a lot of things specific to Waco. Jesse Washington being just one of them. Mm-hmm. But I've got a folder full of stuff, and so we're working on a curriculum. And then, by the way, on one of those days, we want to bring people in from the different communities to talk about their experiences to these police officers, so that the police officers understand it's a real person who's had this experience. Mm-hmm. I know police officers of color who have told me about being in other communities where police officers would treat them differently, not knowing they were police officers, but treating them, they told me very specific. And so you can never dismiss people's perceptions and people's experiences and say, well, we don't treat people like that here. You can't do that.
Right.
Because in those conversations, at least one person has lived it.
Mm-hmm.
So just because I haven't lived that with that person, I still have to acknowledge it.
Right.
Because if I don't, then they're not going to see much value in me. I mean, thousands of doctors get sued for malpractice. Right. If I'm a doctor, and well, can I trust you? Well, your other doctors get sued all the time.
Right. Yeah.
So that automatic defensiveness, that's what we've got to get past. Is as a police department. So as a police profession, and I've said this at some community meetings, police have been used are nothing more than an arm of the government. And so in the past, when there have been unjust laws and unjust initiatives, who carries those out? Police, law enforcement.
Sure.
Whatever that arm looks like, whether it was the Pinkertons, the Union Busters, all these things through history.
Convict labor.
Yeah, convict labor, runaway slave patrols.
Right.
Police, sheriffs, all those things. It's been law enforcement, and so why if you're going to go into law enforcement, you ought to know those things.
Right.
They didn't tell me when I came in. You learn these things.
Yeah.
And so I felt an obligation as a chief. We owe it to our officers to educate them of those things if they don't know them. Race Equity Institute that Cooper Foundation and Waco Foundation have brought. I've got all but one of my assistant chiefs through it. I want all of my commanders to go through it. I want to get it down to all the sergeants. Now, when they put the classes on, they like a certain balance in them, so we can't speed the process up necessarily, but that's in addition to all the other things we're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I wish more than anything that everybody in the community could know all of the officers, to see their hearts in action. I mean, I see police officers go to houses where people don't have air conditioners, and the officers go get air conditioners for people. And this is of all races, and the officers are of all races and come from very different backgrounds. They'll go buy air conditioners for people. They'll do birthdays for kids. They'll do food at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and frankly in the middle of the year. And the officers want no acknowledgement of that. They sometimes I only find out by mistake. Somebody will come in and say, your officers were so nice to me. They did this and this and this. And nobody knew. And we go back and we look at it. And these officers, they're in the communities every day. And so I think sometimes that's where some of the defensiveness comes from, is the police officers saying, hey, we're out here every day. Where's the rest of the community in helping solve these problems? And so if there was one thing, it would be, I wish our community could see the hearts of all the officers. Particularly, and I can't speak for other departments, although I know some really good folks in other departments. So that'd be the one thing, because they're in it for the right reasons. They're doing the hard work. The case with Frankie in the park, that was hard work recovering that young man from a dumpster.
Yeah.
And they had worked that case all night.
Right.
And they had pulled out all the stops and brought in everybody in the world to help search.
Yeah, incredible.
And then and oh, by the way, while they're searching, they also have to work the case and they have to ask the hard questions.
Mhm.
And then the hard questions lead to a really difficult truth.